Alright, today I'm going to be talking to you about independent learning cycles. Now, independent learning cycles are something that I get really excited about. I just love the way that you can make decisions to help move kids through instructional content. And I love the idea of how this just creates more opportunities for different types of face-to-face interactions with students than what you typically and normally are able to do inside of a classroom. So let's go ahead and get started with this. First of all, what is an independent learning cycle? I know it probably sounds pretty new to some of you, so let's go ahead and explore this. In the basic form of an independent learning cycle, it is a learning path that allows students to move through your scope and sequence. So all of those things that you have on your scope and sequence, if you look right here, where I'm going to highlight in yellow right now, these are the different standards that you want to have students work through. So we have students that are going to go to this standard, standard 2, standard 3, standard 4 in this example. Well, in order for students to be able to do that, they have to have an independent learning cycle to be able to do that. And that's what this video is about, is showing you how you can create your own independent learning cycle inside of your classroom that moves students through content. There is no one way to do this. It's really just about guidelines and thinking about the resources that you have available to you, and also thinking about what you priorly have experienced as an instructional leader in your classroom, building those components into this, and then just making good use of everything that you know of what is sound instruction and research-based currently in your classroom. So let's go ahead and take a look a little bit closer. All right, so the next thing is you want to make sure that you have a consistent, flexible learning path that helps students engage with content. Like I said, they need to be able to move through this content independently, and which will allow you to interact with them as you see fit and as needed. A learning path that ensures students interact with content at appropriate levels of rigor. So not only does it create different opportunities, but it also has you interacting with students in a way in which you're going to find you have different levels of rigor that you, instead of just interacting with students during direct instruction, you're now going to have more time to interact with them during your application phases of that. So let's go ahead and explore here. So for example, if a student begins working on standard 2 in your classroom, the first thing that they do inside of this independent learning cycle for this example we're showing you is that the student would take a pre-assessment. Now in our building we're using standards mastery, but basically that's just like a common assessment. So if the student passes the standards mastery, so that means if they get an 80% or higher in our building, we then can push them on to what we call the mastery cycle. In the mastery cycle, a student is going to be applying that standard. So the student would be working on standard 2. They would be applying that here. They've already given us 1 point of mastery right here. We're now looking for the 2nd point of mastery right here. So the student would complete the mastery cycle. If the student completes the mastery cycle, they do not have to take the post-assessment because they've given us 2 solid examples of mastery on content. So the student would then move from the mastery cycle. They then have the option of passing the post-assessment, meaning passing it in terms of not having to take it. They then would follow the cycle on to the next standard. So then on standard 3, they would take the common assessment. If they pass the common assessment, they'd go to mastery cycle. If they didn't do well in the mastery cycle, we would give them the post-assessment, which would give us our 2nd round. They then would go to standard 4, and then they could literally continue along that path. So you can see how this works as this person moves through this independent learning path. So that's an example of if the student passes, if they pass that standards mastery, what that would look like. Now, let's say we have the same thing. We have another student who's taking on standard 2 in this example. They take our common assessment, which is our standards mastery, and they do not pass that. They get below an 80%. We then are going to push them to some blended online content. They would be meeting with the teacher for sure in this too. The teacher has some options there. They can decide which parts of the videos they need to watch. Maybe they don't watch all the videos, or maybe they only need to watch part of the videos. Maybe they don't watch videos at all. Maybe they just need to have one quick interaction with the teacher. They then are going to be asked to practice that. Again, depends on the student too. If they demonstrated to you here in a group that they were ready for the post-assessment or mastery cycle, then you can do that. So you have some options to bump them around. So if they don't pass the post-assessment, they go to some sort of instruction, whether it's blended or in classroom. Then they have a practice sessions. Typically that's where they're playing some games, centers work, those kinds of things from your rotations that you probably have done in your math centers and literacy centers. They then would be asked to apply that standard in a meaningful way during the mastery cycle. So after they've done that, you can see we have several points of mastery. They could have demonstrated some mastery with the teacher here. During the practice, there's not a whole lot of evaluation there in terms of demonstrated mastery. But then the mastery cycle, we get our second point of mastery there. And then they are required in this point to take the post-assessment. If they get 80% or higher, they then can go on to the next standard. And then if they don't pass the one, they move that way again. If they get to the post-assessment, in the first example where we said they move through the blended learning content, the practice sessions, mastery cycle, and then they don't pass the post-assessment, you then can push them back down here to blended content or to practice or even back into the mastery cycle. Or you're just going to be meeting with them quickly and then give them the post-assessment again where it can continue to move them. So you can see in this virtual world that I just showed you with this little guy right here, that you can see that this person in this virtual world, that they're just the independent cycle is just a way for you to manage and know where students are in terms of working through content, which is extremely important because if a student is struggling in any portion on here, you know where they're at and you can grab them for groups and you can meet with them in different capacities in different ways. So in our example, what I've been talking about is our pre-assessment is 80% or higher. We look for mastery. The teacher's always facilitating learning. During that mastery cycle, that portion right here where the guy is, during that mastery cycle, we're constantly having having students demonstrate mastery right here, and we're asking them to apply it using the 4 C's that we talked about during the mastery cycle too. So, and then during the post-assessment, we're also looking for that 80% there as well. So we want to make sure we have that 80% at that post-assessment as well. All right, and then, as I said, there's 2 different paths that students can go on this independent learning cycle. If they pass the first common assessment, then they don't have a post. If they don't pass the first common assessment, the first pre-assessment, then they're going to have a post-assessment. All right, so let's explore a little bit more, because I talked to you a little bit about how it does change your face-to-face interactions with students. So there are lots of benefits of using this model inside of your classroom. The independent learning cycle allows you to better meet your students' needs inside of your classroom. So how does that work? Well, right now, Marzano and his team of researchers have went in and looked at lots and lots of classrooms, and they looked at the time being spent in the classrooms and what tasks were being completed in the classrooms. What they found out is this, that 58% of your classroom time, not your classroom time, but the classroom times in which they were looking at and researching, 58% of the time was spent on foundational learning, which is more of the retrieval and basic comprehension skills. Basically, 58% of the time was just spent on teaching new content and interacting with that new content. So nearly over half the time was spent solely on that. Then there was 36% of the time where students were engaged in a little bit of analysis, but basically it's just more of practice time is what they actually found. So 58% of the time the teacher was spending on new content, which typically means that direct instruction. I'm going to put DI there. Just know that DI stands for direct instruction. So 58% of the time teachers were engaged in direct instruction. 36% of the time the teachers were able to actually interact with students and help them practice something. So that's what would be happening in small groups times. So 36% of the time the teacher was able to practice on the items with the students. And this is kind of staggering, and what they found too here was that 6% of the classroom time was at high levels of rigor, meaning asking students to apply it, think critically on it, using those 4 C's. So only 6% of the time were teachers engaging, having conversations with students around that. So it's more of the drive-by at the higher levels. What's happening in this, what's happening with this independent cycle is something significantly different. During this independent cycle, you're going to find that more of your time is going to be spent up here. Much larger parts of your time will be engaged with students at higher levels of thinking. That mastery cycle that I showed you before right here, when your students are at this mastery cycle, you're going to be able to be interacting with students during that time frame. That's where the 6% happens right here. You're also going to be able to pull groups and meet with them at these higher levels. Most of this direct instruction, you're going to try to push that off and have some videos do some of that teaching and find different other creative ways of using that direct instruction time. So getting the students to take that and use that on their own. And that's a whole nother video in terms of me talking about how that approach works and the research behind that. So you're going to spend more time working with students during knowledge utilization. So you're going to spend more time when they're utilizing their information versus you teaching and onboarding the information. So you're really going to be changing your face-to-face work with them. You're going to become more of a facilitator of learning. You're not going to be standing in the way of the content and in terms of the information that students need. It's going to help create students that are more self-directed. They're going to know where to go find information and get information that they need. Much like we do. If we have trouble, like right now I'm working on my basement, and if I have something in my basement that I'm not sure how to do, I go to YouTube and find a video. That's what we want students to be able to do. We want them to be able to go find resources that they need to solve their problems. It also is going to amplify an effective workshop model. So if you try to implement something like this and you don't have an effective workshop model already in place, it's probably going to implode. So you have to have a solid, effective workshop model, and this is just going to amplify it. It's not going to replace it. It's going to amplify what that already has in place. It changes how you spend your face-to-face time, and I talked a little bit about that already. If you really want to find out more about this type of stuff, these are some of the researchers down here. You can pause the video if you'd like to kind of go and look at some of their work. Some of this work is what we've leaned on to create our independent learning cycle. So how do you build one of your own? Okay, well, that's actually a great question. You know, the first big thing you want to think about is, you know, students. You have to think about how students are going to move through your cycle independently. How are you going to ask them to move through your cycle? So I'm just going to copy this little guy right here and bring him here. How is this little guy going to move through your cycle? What are the different things that you want to have in place for that student to be able to do? So you can see that's one important thing. The next thing is you want to make sure your cycle should require students to complete the level of rigor that's required to demonstrate. I always tell teachers this all the time. When you're creating your independent learning cycle, you want to think about what does mastery look like? What do you expect students to do on standard 2? If you feel like they have to do X, Y, and Z, build your independent learning cycle to make sure that students complete X, Y, and Z. It's really just a way of thinking about what you already do and putting it into a systematic approach. Now, you also want to think about how many points of mastery you're going to want students to display. In our model, you probably remember that I said we were getting 2 solid examples. The rule of thumb is right around 3. We're confident that if a student is able to pass our very rigorous common assessment and then is able to apply that standard in the mastery cycle, that student has demonstrated mastery, and that skill or that understanding is something that's going to stick with them as they move through our school time, our school year. The next thing is you're going to want to figure out if you're going to require students to apply standards mastered as they go, or if you're going to lump standards together. What I mean by that is you don't have to require students to do a mastery cycle every single standard. So you can see on this one, we're asking our students to apply the standard every single time. You can create units. You can say, I want students to do standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, and then I want them to do the mastery cycle down here. Then I want them to do that. That is simply just another way of creating your independent cycle. In that example of that independent cycle, this mastery cycle would not exist in this step. It wouldn't exist right here. The student would go through the pre-assessment. They then, you probably would want one more point of mastery, so you'd want them into practice. Or you'd say pre-assessment, post-assessment, but again, you'd have to decide if that was appropriate for kids or not. So you, again, building your independent cycle, Are you going to require them to apply the standard at every single standard, or are you going to look at more of a unit base? And that is just another way of figuring out how you want that independent learning cycle to look. Hope you enjoyed learning about independent learning cycle.